What up, though? It was once said, quote, God, end quote, gave man dominion over the earth. I don't believe or disbelieve. Anyway, Genesis 1:26. Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. Genesis 1:28. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. James 3:7. For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and sea creature, can be tamed and has been tamed by mankind. Psalm 7:2-8. May he have dominion from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. In the 1828 Webster's American Dictionary of the English Language, it defines dominion as sovereign or supreme authority, the power of governing and controlling, power to direct, control, use, and dispose of at pleasure, right of possession and use without being accountable. In the Johnson 1755 dictionary, it defines dominion as sovereign authority, unlimited power, power, right of possession or use without being accountable. In the Oxford Learner's Dictionary, it defines dominion as authority to rule, control, an area controlled by one political leader. Let's shake it. In this dominion, there lies vanity. Vanity stemming from the interpretation of some men. In this said dominion, a paradox unfolds. Early sailing ships, history of ships, ships of discovery, by John Voucher, 2019. In Europe, for a long time, boats were small, had one mast, and seldom left sight of land. Ships like the Mediterranean galleys and the Nordic drakkar relied mainly on oars for propulsion, aided by square sails when there was a following wind. They would be steered with a side oar that would hang off the back of the boat. The Age of Discovery, 1400 through 1550. Two types of ships were developed: small ships for exploration, caravels, a shallow draft to chart unknown waters, ability to sail to windward, lateen sails, small crew, cargo space for voyages of up to a year, larger ships for war and commerce, carracks, high platforms at front and back from which to fire at opponents, armed with cannons, square sails for more sail area, large payload. The design of caravels underwent changes over the years, but a typical caravel of the late 15th century may be described as a broad-beamed vessel of 50 or 60-ton burden. Some were as large as 160 tons, about 75 feet. Top speed for a caravel was about 8 knots. The average was 4 knots for 90 to 100 miles in a day. In 1492, Columbus used two caravels, the Nina and the Pinta, and a larger carrack, the Santa Maria, as his flagship. Into the 19th century, clippers. In Europe, the Napoleonic Wars brought further refinement of square rig sailing configurations. In North America, the Americans designed the clipper as a response to the British naval blockade in the War of 1812. The clipper was developed for speed, often capable of reaching 20 knots, in contrast to the 5 to 6 knots attained by other cargo ships of the day. It would serve for commerce of tea and opium. The Hellenistic giant galley. This is from the Archaeologist, Civilizations of the World. The Hellenistic giant galley, Tessaracantérus, one of the largest human-powered vessels in history, 2022. The early successors of Alexander gave a boost in the use and the development of the Polaris-type warships, using them widely in their wars. The successors have built fleets comprised of numerous large warships reaching the building of colossal vessels such as the Elkoceras and the enormous Tessaracantérus. These warships resembled to floating fortresses, very similar in size to the modern large battleships and aircraft carriers. The Tessaracantérus had a crew of 6,000 men, as many as a modern aircraft carrier. Tesoro Corteris, or simply 40, was a very large catamaran galley reportedly built in the Hellenistic period by Ptolemy the Fourth. Philopater of Egypt. It was described by a number of ancient sources, including a lost work by Caliceres of Rhodes and surviving text by Athenaeus and Plutarch. According to these descriptions, supported by modern research by Lionel Casson, the enormous size of the vessel made it impractical, and it was built only as a prestige vessel rather than an effective warship. The name 40 refers not to the number of oars, but to the number of rowers on each column of oars that propelled it. And at the size described, it would have been the largest ship constructed in antiquity, and probably the largest human-powered vessel ever built. HMW HMY Yachts, a timeline of the world's largest passenger ships from 1831 to present. SS Royal William, 160 feet. 1831 through 1837. 1837 through 1839, SS Great Western, 252 feet. What are the largest passenger ships of all time? Take a deep dive through maritime history to discover when famous ocean liners and cruise ships such as the SS Great Eastern, RMS Titanic, SS France, RMS Queen Mary II, and Symphony of the Seas have held the title of biggest passenger ships in the world. (1839 through 1840) SS British Queen, 245 feet. 1840 through 41 SS President, 243 feet. 1841 through 43 SS British Queen, 245 feet. 1843 through 53 SS Great Britain, 322 feet. SS Great Eastern, 1858 through 88, 692 feet. 88 through 93, 560 feet. 1893 through 97, RMS Campania and RMS Lucania, 622 feet. 1897 through 99, SS Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse, 655 feet. RMS Oceanic, 1899 through 1901, 704 feet. 1901 through 03, RMS Celtic, 701 feet. 1903 through 04, RMS Cedric, 700 feet. RMS Baltic, 729 feet. SS Kaiserin Auguste Victoria, 677 feet. RMS Lusitania, 787 feet. RMS Mauritania, 790 feet. 1911 through 1912, RMS Olympia, 882 feet. 1912, RMS Titanic, 882.9 feet. 1912 through 1913, RMS Olympic, 300 or 882 feet. SS Imperator, 906 feet. SS Vaterland, 950 feet. RMS Majestic, 956 feet. SS Normandy, 1,029 feet, and that's in 1935 through 36. 1936 RMS Queen Mary, 1,019 feet. 1936 through 46 SS Normandy, 1,029 feet. RMS Queen Elizabeth. SS France, 1972, 1,035 feet. MS Sovereign of the Seas, 880 feet. SS Norway, 1,035 feet. Sun Princess, 857 feet. Carnival Destiny, 893 feet. That's in 1996 through 1998. 1998 through 99, Grand Princess, 951 feet. Voyager of the Seas, 1,020 feet. Explorer of the Seas, 1,020 feet. Navigator of the Seas, 1,020 feet. RMS Queen Mary, 2, 1,132 feet. Freedom of the Seas, 1,111 feet. Liberty of the Seas, 1,111 feet. Oasis of the Seas, 1,180 feet. Harmony of the Seas, 1,188 feet, and that's in 2016 through 2018. In 2018 to the present, Symphony of the Seas, 1,184 feet. What is the largest cruise ship in the world? By gross tonnage, the largest cruise ship in the world is Royal Caribbean Symphony of the Seas. The megaship has a gross tonnage of 228,081, is 1,184 feet long, and has a maximum passenger capacity of 6,680 people. Interestingly, its predecessor, Harmony of the Seas, retains the largest cruise ship capacity title, with the ability to hold 6,687 people at maximum, 7 more than Symphony. In 2021, Royal Caribbean is projected to retain the title with the launch of Wonder of the Seas, which will become the new largest cruise ship in the world once construction is completed. How big was the Titanic versus modern ships? In April 1912, the RMS Titanic was not only the largest passenger ship in the world, but it was the largest ship ever built. The Titanic was 882 feet long and had a gross tonnage of 46,328 and a maximum passenger capacity of 2,435 people. Comparing the Symphony of the Seas versus the Titanic, Royal Caribbean's biggest ship categorically dwarfs the Titanic's size in every way, more than doubling its passenger capacity and nearly quintupling its gross tonnage. What is the difference between an ocean liner and a cruise ship? An ocean liner is typically used as a means of transportation across oceans or seas, whereas cruise ships are typically used for leisure and sightseeing and start and stop at the same port. Both ocean liners and cruise ships are passenger ships. What is the biggest ship in the world? The biggest ship in the world by gross tonnage is the crane vessel Pioneering Spirit at a staggering 403,342 GT or gross tonnage. The ship was launched in 2013 and is used in the installation of oil platforms at sea. The largest ship in the world by length is the oil tanker Seawise Giant at 1,504 feet. It was in service from 1979 to 2009. In the decades since its retirement, no ship has surpassed its length. The world's longest ships by type. Seawise Giant, 1979 to 2009. Barzan, 2015 to present. Pioneering Spirit. Let's go back. Seawise Giant, oil tanker, 1979 through 2009. Barzan, 2015 to present, a container ship. Pioneering Spirit, 2015 to present, a crane vessel. Harmony of the Seas, 2016 to present, a passenger ship. Vale Brazil, 2011 to present, a bulk carrier. QMax, 2008 to present, LMG carrier. Paul R. Tregurtha, 1981 to present. Azem, 2013 to present, a private motor yacht. And that's 590 feet. Wyoming, 450 feet, 1909 to 1924, a wooden ship. This is from HMY Yachts, a timeline of ships, boats, and yachts. Ships and boats are two of the oldest types of transportation and were first built thousands of years ago. They have been used for a number of other reasons, including to transport cargo, fishing, as a type of defense from armed forces, sports, leisure, and relaxation. Today, ships, boats, and yachts are built using advanced technology and materials differing greatly from those that have been used throughout history. 2500 BC, around this time, the ancient Egyptians began to build wooden ships, wooden boats that were able to withstand sailing across oceans. 1450. Starting around 1450 and for several centuries, wooden ships with 3 or 4 masts were in use by several different countries. These masted sailing ships were used as trade vessels by explorers to transport cargo and as battleships. 1660, Charles II of England chose to use a yacht to carry him to the Netherlands from England for his restoration. Previously, yachts had been used by the Dutch Navy. After Charles II used a yacht, they became vessels that were known to transport important persons. 1800s, clipper ships were built in the 1800s and were fast-sailing ships that featured tall masts and slim, long hulls. 1818, the Black Ball Line was a shipping company that began offering passenger service from the United States to England. 1819, the first ships that were built using steam power began to cross the Atlantic Ocean. Steamships used a combination of wind and steam power to move. This is from Cruise Hive. World's biggest cruise ship sails across Atlantic Ocean, by Emrys Thacker. For the first time ever, the biggest cruise ship in the world is sailing a transatlantic cruise. Harmony of the Seas is heading to the United States for the first time since it entered service in May 2016. The ship is sailing a 14-day cruise which departed Barcelona, Spain on October 23rd. During the transatlantic voyage, Harmony of the Seas will call at Palma de Mallorca and Mayaga before hitting the open seas of the Atlantic Ocean. The crossing, which can be choppy at times, will come to an end when the ship arrives at its new home port of Port Everglades, Florida, on November 5th. The ship is 227,000 gross tons and is the third in the Oasis class. Harmony of the Seas can carry 5,475 passengers at double occupancy. Symphony of the Seas sets new record. Royal Caribbean Symphony of the Seas sets transatlantic crossing record. By George Oliver. Royal Caribbean is well known for having the largest cruise ships currently in operation. But recently, the line managed to snag another award: the most people to ever cross the Atlantic Ocean on a single ship in peacetime. Carrying a total of 7,604 people on board, including 5,350 passengers and 2,224 crew members. The Royal Caribbean ship departed from Miami on March 9, 2023 at almost 100% capacity and spent 9 full days at sea before arriving in Malaga on March 19th. Symphony of the Seas' transatlantic journey is scheduled to end on March 21st in Barcelona. Symphony of the Seas. Built in 2018, the 228,081-ton Symphony of the Seas held the distinction of being the world's largest cruise ship until 2022, when sister ship Wonder of the Seas took its title. Both Oasis-class ships are set to be surpassed in size by Royal Caribbean's upcoming vessel, Icon of the Seas. Scheduled to debut in January 2024, the 250,800-ton ship will have maximum capacity for 7,600 passengers. A second Icon-class ship, currently unnamed, is under construction and is scheduled to debut in 2025. Oceanpreneur. What kind of boats cross the Atlantic Ocean? 7 options explained. 2022. Many privately owned sailing vessels cross the Atlantic to spend a sunny sailing season either in the Mediterranean or Caribbean or as part of their around the world voyage. Many boats choose to stop in Cape Verde or the Azores and often don't have flight schedules and don't have tight schedules. 90% of the boats crossing the ocean is bigger than 36 feet, with most of them measuring around 44 feet. A smaller yacht could also be perfectly ocean worthy. I've seen boats of 26 feet crossing. Some adventure people row across the Atlantic. In 2017, someone even stand up paddled across the Atlantic. 6 people out of 100 I interviewed in my book crossed the Atlantic on a boat smaller than 36 feet. This year, we also have Nadiem, Ocean Nomads member, who will sail across in his little sailboat. A yacht is a super yacht when it is over 24 meters, 79 feet. These are big yachts. They often have generators running every day to keep fridges and freezers going. They load up thousands of liters of fuel and water and are less dependent on the wind. In most cases, there will also be more people on board, 5 to 8 people compared to 3 to 5 on smaller vessels. More and more cruise ships cross the Atlantic to do the season on the other side. These floating cities are not an environmentally friendly way to cross. It takes around 8 days and a lot of noise to cross with the cruise ship. Data on emissions is remarkably difficult to find. Some sources state that an average cruise ship at sea emits more and less filtered smoke than 1 million cars combined each day. In a 1 week trip, a large cruise ship generates 10 backyard swimming pools of black water, raw sewage, and 40 more swimming pools of gray water, water from sinks, baths, showers, laundry, and galleys. They also generate large volumes of oily bilge water, sewage sludge, garbage, and noise. More cargo ships cross the Atlantic than sailboats. This is a non sailing ship option that can take you across. Reference.com. How long did it take to get across the Atlantic in the 1700s? 2020. Ships in the 1700s relied on sails to propel them. The length of the voyage greatly depended on the wind. An immigrant who made the journey in 1750 reported that it could take between 8 and 12 weeks, while another who arrived in 1724 reported that the journey took 6 weeks and 3 days. These journeys do not include periods during which ships remained anchored in a harbor in either England or the American colonies while they were filled with cargo. According to the first-hand accounts of immigrants, ships sometimes remained anchored at a port for as many as 3 weeks at a time. Immigrants were also forced to spend longer amounts of time on ships once they got to the American colonies if they could not afford to pay the required passage fee. Those who could not pay were required to remain on board the ship until they were sold into indentured servitude and forced to work to pay for their voyage. The journey across the Atlantic Ocean was very difficult. First-hand accounts speak of illness, cramped quarters, food and water rations, and death. Because the journey was so long, when passengers died, their bodies were thrown overboard because there was no way to store them on the ship. Micro B life. How long did it take to sail across the Atlantic in 1776? How long did it take to sail across the Atlantic in 1776? The perilous transatlantic crossing usually took at least 6 weeks and could take as long as 2 or 3 months. How long did it take to cross the Atlantic in the 1700s? In 1492, it took Columbus 2 months to cross the Atlantic. In the 18th and 19th century, it still took on average 6 weeks. If weather conditions were bad, it could take up to 3 months. How long did it take to cross the Atlantic in the late 1800s? In the early 19th century, sailing ships took about 6 weeks to cross the Atlantic. With adverse winds or bad weather, the journey could take as long as 14 weeks. When this happened, passengers would often run short of provisions. How long did it take to sail from Africa to America? The journey between Africa and the Americas could take 4 to 6 weeks, but the average lasted between 2 and 3 months. What is the shortest distance across the Atlantic Ocean? The shortest distance across the Atlantic Ocean, circa 1,600 miles, is between southwest Senegal, West Africa, and northeast Brazil, East South America. This is from Linda Lee Graham, Crossing the Atlantic. Linda Lee Graham, Life in the 18th Century. Many of those immigrating to America paid via indentured servitude, not American Express. They sold their future services for a number of years, not months, to an American looking for a servant. Gottlieb Mittelberger, a German schoolmaster, traveled from Europe to Philadelphia in the mid 1700s. His diary left a vivid eyewitness account of the journey. During the voyage, there is on board these ships terrible misery, stench, fumes, horror, vomiting, many kinds of seasickness, fever, dysentery, headache, heat, constipation, boils, scurvy, cancer, mouth rot, and the like, all of which come from the old and sharply salted food and meat, also from very bad and foul water, so that many die miserably. Add to this want of provisions, hunger, thirst, frost, heat, dampness, anxiety. Want, afflictions, and lamentations, together with other trouble, as for example, the lice abound so frightfully, especially on sick people, that they can be scraped off the body. The misery reaches a climax when a gale rages for 2 or 3 nights and days, so that everyone believes that the ship will go to the bottom with all human beings on board. In such a visitation, the people cry and pray most piteously. No one can have an idea of the sufferings which women in confinement have to bear with their innocent children on board these ships. Few of this class escape with their lives. Many a mother is cast into the water with her child as soon as she is dead. Other diaries from the 18th and early 19th century survive as well, and the theme of misery in the crossings is commonplace in all. Sailing education. Sailor advice. How hard is it to sail across the Atlantic? To sail the Atlantic Ocean, you can cross through parts of the country such as Cape Verde, the Canary Islands, and Portugal. If you begin sailing east and head west, other routes include going along the Northern Passage. Before you leave port, you must be aware of and well prepared for the following situations and dangers: a long journey, large waves, strong weather including hurricanes, whales. On average, you'll spend 3 to 4 weeks aboard your sailboat voyaging across the Atlantic Ocean. Some more experienced sailors have cut the trip length down to 2 weeks, halving their travel time. This isn't the norm. So you have to anticipate that you'll spend the better part of a month on your sailboat riding out the oceanic waves. If you start west and head east, which is taking the Northern Passage, here's how the travel breaks down. From the Caribbean to Bermuda, you'll travel 5 to 8 days. Then, as you head from Bermuda to the Azores, you can spend 2 weeks to 17 days along that route. From the Azores to Portugal, that's between 4 and 8 days. Tacked on anywhere from 3 to 10 more days to get to where you want to go specifically. That's 26 days on the lower end and 43 days on the higher end to cross the Atlantic Ocean. Beginning in Portugal and riding to the Canary Islands would take 5 to 7 days, so about a week. Then you'd spend 5 to 8 days venturing from the Canary Islands to Cape Verde. Finally, from the Canary Islands to the Windward Islands, add on 16 to 21 days. Part of this involves gathering the appropriate supplies, but also making sure you're physically and mentally prepped for the long stretch of time at sea that's ahead. From June to November, which is typically some of the warmest months of the year in the U.S., you want to stay away from the Atlantic Ocean, especially the Canary Islands. This period is hurricane season in the Canaries. Your safest period for embarking is from November to February. Trade winds are handy. If you don't have them, then don't anticipate you'll zip through the Atlantic. Most sailors who have ridden the Atlantic and discussed their experience say the average speed of travel is about 5 knots. That's the rough equivalent of 5.75 miles per hour. So we'll round that up to 6 miles per hour. You must anticipate quick weather shifts and be ready to act. You are in an ocean, so you have to expect the waves can be a lot more vicious than sailing in a local lake. In the Atlantic Ocean especially, The propensity for large waves is much greater, so you can't sail without a plan. Summertime sailing along Atlantic routes could put you in the eye of a hurricane, or at least in its vicinity. Even if you skip hurricane season by sailing later in the year, squalls and heavy storms are common all year long. Your boat could hit a sleeping whale just under the water, causing it to move and capsize your boat. In some instances, a whale could even perceive your sailboat as a threat and try to attack it. Sailing across the Atlantic Ocean can take 30 to 40 days. Let's shake it. This is from encyclopediavirginia.org. The sardine can. BBC, A History of the World, the Brooks Slave Ship Model. The model was based on an actual slave ship built in Liverpool in 1780 through 81 and co-owned by Joseph Brooks, a Liverpool merchant. Later mistakenly referred to as the Brooks, it was one of 9 ships measured for the 1788 parliamentary inquiry into the British slave trade. 2 models of the ship were commissioned by the abolitionist Thomas Clarkson. This is the one he gave to William Wilberforce, MP for Hull. Wilberforce showed the model to members in the House of Commons during the campaign to abolish the slave trade, using it as a visual and to highlight the brutality of the Middle Passage. Again, it was one of 9 ships measured for the 1788 parliamentary inquiry into the British slave trade. The British slave trade. This is the one he gave to William Wilberforce, MP for Hull. Wilberforce showed the model to members in the House of Commons during the campaign to abolish the slave trade, using it as a visual and to highlight the brutality of the Middle Passage. The ship was built to carry 451 people, and the poster attached to the model shows the amount of space each individual would have. The overcrowding shocked everyone who saw it. Even more shocking is that record shows that in 1783, the vessel carried more than 600 enslaved Africans across the Atlantic to the Americas. University of Virginia Special Collections. Thomas Clarkson, author, 1808. Slave ship diagram. A schematic drawing of the slave ship Brooks, also known as the Brooks, portrays the inhumane living conditions that enslaved Africans endured during the Middle Passage. This fold-out engraving was published in 1808 edition of the History of the Rise, Progress, and Accomplishment of the Abolition of the African Slave Trade by British Parliament, a 2-volume work published by the English activist Thomas Clarkson, a leading opponent of the international slave trade. He wrote that this famous print of the plan and section of a slave ship was designed to give the spectator an idea of the sufferings of the Africans in the Middle Passage. This is from Synonym. What happened on the Brooks slave ship? Laura Letty Turner. In the mid-1800s, trader John Hawkins sailed from England to the west coast of Africa, where he purchased African slaves. He sailed west to the Caribbean, where he traded the slaves for sugar and tobacco before returning home. Question: how many African slaves? Of the many slave trading ships, none achieved the notoriety of the Brooks. A poster depicting its human cargo and the deplorable conditions on board was instrumental in ultimately abolishing Great Britain's slave trade. The Brooks was built in 1781 for Joseph Brooks, Jr., a slave trade merchant in Liverpool, the most prosperous of England's 3 slave ship ports. The Brooks was a large ship measuring 100 feet in length and 27 feet in width. The height between the decks where the slaves were stowed was about 5 feet 8 inches. The ship weighed in at about 300 tons. It was a fast, full-rigged ship that was well known, successfully run, and a veteran of 10 trips to the coast of Africa. It was a fast, full-rigged ship that was well known, successfully run, and a veteran of 10 trips to the coast of Africa. The Regulated Slave Trade Act, which determined the number of slaves a ship could legally transport based on its size, was passed by Parliament in 1788. That same year, Prime Minister William Pitt sent Captain Perry, a naval officer, to inspect and measure slave ships docked at Liverpool. Of the 26 ships Perry inspected, he measured 9, including the Brooks. Perry found that the Brooks afforded the second smallest space per slave of all the ships he measured. The Brooks was legally permitted to carry about 460 slaves. However, the ship's record showed it had transported about 600 slaves on 3 occasions, and on one voyage carried 740 slaves in its cargo hold. Perry's report also indicated that the mortality rate among the Brooks slaves population was nearly 12%. At this point, my question is, where are the slaves being taken from, and where are they being delivered to? Where are the slaves being taken from, and where are they being delivered to? In 1787, Cambridge student Thomas Clarkson took up the cause of abolishing slavery after winning a Latin essay contest on the topic. Clarkson joined other abolitionists in forming the Committee for the Abolition of the African Slave Trade and rallied the support of Parliament member William Wilberforce. Wilberforce advised Clarkson to gather evidence of the slave trade's horrors. Among the information Clarkson obtained was Perry's account of the Brooks. Abolitionist William Elford used this information to create a broadside depicting a graphic cutaway drawing of the Brooks showing its cramped quarters. Accompanying text detailed conditions on board the ship, and a cartouche showing a slave in chains with the words, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And a cartouche showed a slave, meaning one, in chains with the words, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Elford's broadside. Broadsides means the side of a ship above the waterline. This is from wordnik.com. Broadside means the side of a ship above the waterline, from wordnik.com. Elford's broadside of the Brooks was widely distributed throughout Great Britain and the Americas. Wilberforce also showed members of the House of Commons a wooden model of the boat during his campaign to abolish the slave trade. The Brooks on-board surgeon, Dr. Thomas Trotter, testified before Parliament that slaves were packed as tightly in the hold that he suspected many died of asphyxiation during the months-long voyage. The Brooks became the haunting symbol of Great Britain's slave trade in 1807. The Brooks became the haunting symbol of Great Britain's slave trade in 1807. Great Britain made the slave trade illegal. The Brooks became the haunting symbol of Great Britain's slave trade. In 1807, Great Britain made the slave trade illegal, and in 1833, it abolished slavery altogether. The Brooks made its last slave trading voyage in 1804, during which it was captured and kept in Buenos Aires, Argentina. It was kept in Argentina. you find out where it came from, or if it came from anywhere at all. Again, it was kept in Argentina. Find out where it came from. You. Yeah, you. Find out where it came from, or if it in fact came from anywhere at all. The Brooks made its last slave trading voyage in 1804, during which it was captured and kept in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Hull Museum's collection, the Brooks ship model and poster. The abolitionists had to win over the hearts and minds of both members of Parliament and the public if they were going to be successful in their campaign for the abolition of slavery. Remember, slavery, labor, working, employment. The abolitionists had to win over the hearts and minds of both members of Parliament and the public if they were going to be successful in their campaign for the abolition of slavery, for the abolition of laboring, for the abolition of working, for the abolition of employment. With no mass media, television, or radio, the abolitionists had to reach a wide audience with a powerful message. They achieved this by the publication of the Brooks slave ship poster and a ship model. The poster and the ship model were based on the actual slave ship that was built in Liverpool, 1780 through 81. It continued to be a slave ship until 1804 and was named after its co-owner, Joseph Brooks, a Liverpool merchant. The ship was later mistakenly referred to as the Brooks and was one of 9 ships measured for the 1788 Parliament inquiry into the British slave trade. The British slave trade. Yeah, I'm saying it like I'm kind of perplexed, kind of confused. I'm used to hearing something else in front of slave trade, just not British. Let's shake it. The original idea came from the Plymouth Abolitionist Committee, who created a sketch of the slave ship diagram for use in their campaign. The London Committee realized the potential for this powerful image. A very powerful image. It's still powerful to this day. And produced another ship diagram showing a detailed engraving of the Brooks storage plan. In 1789, more than 7,000 posters were printed and circulated throughout England. Thomas Clarkson used this poster in his anti-slave trade tours, and its powerful imagery made an impact on everybody who saw it. In 1789, more than 7,000 posters were printed. The poster and the ship model were based on an actual slave ship that was built in Liverpool in 1780. The ship was actually built in 1780. The 7,000 posters were circulated throughout England in 1789. And it continued to be a slave ship until 1804. The ship was built in 1780. 7,000 posters were printed and circulated in 1789. And it continued to be a slave ship until 1804. 1780, 1789, 1804. The ship model was shown to MPs in Parliament by William Wilberforce during the abolition campaign. It was used to highlight the brutality of the Middle Passage as part of the abolitionists' fight against the slave trade. The Middle Passage. What is the starting point and ending point of the Middle Passage? Being that we're talking about the British slave trade, the Middle Passage. What is the starting point and ending point of the Middle Passage? Description of a slave ship about 1788. USI Understanding Slavery Initiative. This is a print showing how Africans were packed into the slave ship Brooks, with text recording the dimensions and an amount of space available. It was commissioned by Thomas Clarkson from the abolitionist publisher James Phillips in 1788, and the committees of the abolition of slavery used it to inform and shock the public. Each person only had space 16 inches wide to lie in, and they could neither sit up fully nor stand. Over 7,000 posters of the plan were printed and distributed to promote the abolition campaign. The ship Brooks was built in Liverpool in the 1780s and carried over 600 enslaved Africans on 2 Atlantic crossings in 1783. The Brooks image was used to campaign to limit the number of enslaved Africans on board. An act of Parliament in 1788, the Dolben Act, limited the number of slaves that could be carried according to the ship's tonnage. This meant the Brooks could then only carry 454 African captives. National Archives. The slave trade. At the Constitutional Convention in 1787, delegates fiercely debated the issue of slavery. They ultimately agreed that the United States would potentially cease importations of slaves in 1808. An act of Congress passed in 1800 made it illegal for Americans to engage in the slave trade between nations and gave U.S. authorities the right to seize slave ships which were caught transporting slaves and confiscate their cargo. Then the act prohibiting the importation of slaves took effect in 1808. However, a domestic or coastwise trade in slaves persisted between ports within the United States, as demonstrated by slave manifests and court records. A warrant was issued for the ship Charming Sally in 1803. It ordered the marshal and deputies of the Massachusetts district to arrest and take into custody the ship Charming Sally and her appurtenances, equipment, and cargo. A warrant was issued. U.S. versus Schooners Constitution, Marino, Louisa, and 84 slaves, 1825. This case from 1825 tells the story of the illegal importation of slaves. A ship captain was convicted and the ship's cargo, including the enslaved people on board, was sold, with the proceeds of the sale turned over to the court. The account of the sale of 15 African slaves sold on April 19, 1825, lists the enslaved people and their sale price. This manifest, a list of passengers or cargo aboard a ship, shows two enslaved women named Betsy and Harriet, who were being transported aboard the ship Ohio from New Orleans to Philadelphia in 1821. It includes the sworn statement of the ship captain that he was not engaged in the transatlantic slave trade. Though the act prohibiting importation of slaves had been enacted in 1807, the interstate sale of slaves remained legal. The manifest, a list of passengers or cargo aboard a ship, shows two enslaved women named Betsy and Harriet, who were being transported aboard the ship Ohio from New Orleans to Philadelphia in 1821. Trafficking is what you would call it today. Two women. National Park Service, the Middle Passage. Voices of the Middle Passage. Belinda Sutton submitted a petition to the Massachusetts General Court in 1783 to argue her right to a pension from the estate of her enslaver Isaac Royal Jr. This petition provides an account of her experience being forcibly removed from her homeland and brought to the colonies. Her affrighted imagination, in its most alarming extension, never represented distresses equal to what she had since really experienced. Again, Belinda Sutton submitted a petition to the Massachusetts General Court in 1783 to argue her right to a pension from the estate of her enslaver Isaac Royal Jr. This is one woman. This petition provides an account of her experience being forcibly removed from her homeland and brought to the colonies. Where is her homeland? Where was she brought from? We know she was brought to the colonies. But where was she brought from? Tell me in the comment section. Tell me where she was brought from in the comment section. Olaudah Equiano, in his personal narrative, Olaudah Equiano recounts his kidnapping, enslavement, and life in freedom. Equiano dedicated his life to advocating against slavery and published this narrative to help illustrate the horrors of this system. The first object which saluted my eyes when I arrived on the coast was the sea. The first object which saluted my eyes when I arrived on the coast was the sea. Alexander Falconbridge. Dr. Alexander Falconbridge served as a surgeon aboard a number of slave ships in the late 1700s. He later became an activist in anti-slavery work. The following is excerpted from his book, An Account of the Slave Trade on the Coast of Africa. The hardships and inconveniences suffered by the Negroes during the passage are scarcely to be enumerated or conceived. Austin Bierce, in his book Reminiscences of Fugitive Slave Law Days in Boston, sailor and abolitionist, recounts his time shipping enslaved Africans in the southern states. Though not referring specifically to the Middle Passage across the Atlantic Ocean, Bierce's account gives further insight into New England's complicity with slavery and the slave trade and the horrors experienced by its victims. Though not referring specifically to the Middle Passage across the Atlantic Ocean, between the years of 1818 and 1830, I was from time to time mate on board of different vessels engaged in the coasting trade on the coast of South Carolina. The coasting trade on the coast of South Carolina. It is well known that many New England vessels are in the habit of spending their winters on the southern coast in pursuit of this business. For vessels used to run up the rivers for the rice and cotton of the plantations, which we took to Charleston. We often carried gangs of slaves to the plantations as they had been ordered. These slaves were generally collected by slave traders in Charleston, brought there by various causes such as the death of owners and the division of estates, which threw them into the market. Some were sent as punishment for insubordination, or because the domestic establishment was too large, or because persons moving to the north and west preferred selling their slaves to the trouble of carrying them. We had on board our vessels from time to time numbers of these slaves, sometimes 2 or 3, and sometimes as high as 70 or 80. They were separated from their families and connections with as little concern as calves and pigs are selected out of a lot of domestic animals. We used to allow the relatives and friends of the slaves to come on board and stay all night with their friends before the vessel sailed. We used to allow the relatives and friends of the slaves to come on board and stay all night with their friends before the vessel sailed. We had on board our vessels from time to time members of these slaves, sometimes 2 or 3, and sometimes as high as 70 or 80. They were separated from their families and connections with as little concern as calves and pigs are selected out of a lot of domestic animals. People working, going on a boat to go do a job, to go do jobs. They people was allowed to come on the boat, stay with them before they was to leave and go make their money and bring it back or send it back or not ever be heard of again. We used to allow the relatives and friends of the slaves. We used to allow the relatives and friends of the workers, of the laborers, of the employees to come on board and stay all night with their friends before the vessel sailed. In the morning, it used to be my business to pull off the hatches and warn them that it was time to separate. And the shrieks and cries at these times were enough to make anybody's heart ache. See, there were no cell phones. If someone was leaving to go somewhere, to go to work, you just didn't know if you would see them again. Just like today, you have cell phones. But it's something else. maybe entitlement, maybe indoctrination, maybe your education slash nurturing slash nourishing that makes you believe when someone you love, when a loved one goes to work in the morning, that they are coming home. What is it? What is it that makes you believe that they're coming home? In the morning, it used to be my business to pull off the hatches and warn them that it was time to separate. And the shrieks and cries at these times were enough to make anybody's heart ache. There are no shrieks and cries today. Just a hug, a kiss on the cheek. Bye. Love you. See you later. After this experience, Austin Beers decided that because I no longer think it right to see these things in silence, I trade no more south of Mason and Dixon lines. He later became an active and leading member of Boston's abolitionist community. So, think about it. Abolishing slavery, abolishing work, abolishing labor, abolishing employment, abolishing these things for someone else, abolishing laboring for someone else's benefit. Maybe. As a major port city, Boston played a role in this global economic story. The first slave trade voyage from the American colonies sailed out of Massachusetts. As a major port city, Boston played a role in this global economic story. The first slave trade voyage from the American colonies sailed out of Massachusetts. The ship Desire left Salem in 1637 carrying Native American captives, carrying American Indians, carrying possibly your family, captives from the Pequot War to be sold as slaves in the Caribbean. From Boston to the Caribbean. After this documented case of enslavement, Massachusetts legalized the enslavement of Africans, Native Americans, and mixed race people in the colony's body of liberties. Where does the African come from? Look what this says. Just imported from Africa and to be sold at number 19 on the Long Wharf, a parcel of likely healthy Negro slaves. I'm going to leave it to you to dodge this hijack. This word Negro seems to be synonymous with facial features, with physical attributes, with African. This is very confusing. But it's meant to be confusing. Whose fault is it that it's confusing? I think it's your fault. In 1783, the Massachusetts Supreme Court decided that slavery was incompatible with the new state constitution. In 1808, Britain and the United States agreed to ban the transatlantic slave trade. American Heritage, Middle Passage, Daniel P. Mannix, Malcolm Cowley, 1962, Volume 13, Issue 2. From 1700 to 1807, 1807, when the trade was legally abolished by Great Britain and the United States, more than 7,000 Negroes were carried across the Atlantic in any normal year. The trade was interrupted by wars, notably the American Revolution, but the total New World importation for the century may have amounted to 5 million enslaved persons. Most of the slaves were carried on shipboard at some point along the 4,000 miles of West African coastline that extend in a dog's leg from the Sahara on the north to the southern desert. Known as the Guinea Coast, it was feared by 18th century mariners who died there by hundreds and thousands every year. Contrary to popular opinions, very few of the slaves, possibly 1 or 2 out of 100, were free Africans kidnapped by Europeans. The slaving captains had, as a rule, no moral prejudice against man stealing, but they usually refrained from it on the ground of its being a dangerous business practice. A vessel suspected of man stealing might be cut off by the natives, its crew killed, and its cargo of slave offered for sale to other vessels. Intertribal wars, the principal source of slaves. Library of Congress, Immigration and Relocation in U.S. History, Beginnings, Exploration and Colonization. Africans came to the New World in the earliest days of the Age of Exploration. In the early 1500s, Africans trekked across the many lands in North, Central, and South America that were claimed by Spain, some coming in freedom and some in slavery, working as soldiers, interpreters, or servants. Explorers of African descent joined the expeditions of Francisco Vasquez de Coronado, Ponce de Leon, Hernan Cortés, Hernando de Soto, and many more. Esteban de Dorantes, also known as Estevanico, who was born in Morocco and held in slavery by a Spanish captain, traveled from Cuba to what is now Florida, was shipwrecked near Galveston, and served as a scout and interpreter on long journeys throughout Mexico and the land that is now the state of New Mexico. PBS, 100 Amazing Facts About the Negro. How many slaves landed in the U.S.? By Henry Louis Gates, Jr. The most comprehensive analysis of shipping records over the course of the slave trade is the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, edited by Professors David Eltis and David Richardson. The editors are careful to say that all their figures are estimates. I believe that they are the best estimates that we have, the proverbial gold standard in the field of the study of the slave trade. Henry Louis Gates Jr. says, Smithsonian Magazine. The Clotilda, the last known slave ship to arrive in the U.S., is found. Allison Keyes, Museum Correspondent, 2019. "159 years ago, slave traders stole Lorna Gall Wood's great-great-grandfather from what is now Benin in West Africa. Her ancestor, Charlie Lewis, was brutally ripped from his homeland, along with 109 other Africans, and brought to Alabama on the Clotilda. the last known slave ship to arrive in the United States. $159 ago. Somebody subtract that from 2023. I am not good at math. Or rather, quick computations. Then last year, it seemed that Ben Raines, a reporter with AL.com, had found the Clotilda. But that wreck turned out to be too large to be the missing ship. Gardulo says everyone involved got moving on several fronts to deal with a complicated archaeological search process to find the real Clotilda. They gonna go find it. This was a search not only for a ship, this was a search to find our history. And this was a search for identity. And this was a search for justice. Gardulo explained, a search for justice. Let's get that ship so we can have some justice around here. What that sign say? Welcome to Africa Town. Okay. The U.S. banned the importation of the enslaved from Africa in 1808. In 1860, his schooner sailed from Mobile to what was then the Kingdom of Dahomey under Captain William Foster. He brought Africans captured by warring tribes back to Alabama, skulking into Mobile Bay under the cover of night, then up to Mobile River. Foster then ordered the Clotilda taken upstream, burned, and sunk to conceal the evidence of their illegal activity. After being freed by Union soldiers in 1865, the Clotilda survivor. Wait. Foster then ordered the Clotilda taken upstream, burned, and sunk to conceal the evidence of their illegal activity. This reads so beautifully like a novel. Spick and span, it's clean. Feel me? Let's shake it. After being freed by Union soldiers they just jumped right to it. After being freed by Union soldiers in 1865, the Clotilda survivors, we just get all the way to the survivors. We go from people being taken, then under the cover of night, pulling into the Mobile port. And then we go to 1865, the Clotilda survivors sought to return to Africa, but they didn't have enough money. They pulled wages they earned from selling vegetables and working in fields and mills to purchase land from the Mihir family. So many people along the way didn't think that happened because we didn't have proof. By this ship being found, we have the proof that we need to say that this is the ship that they were on, and their spirits are in this ship. Get out your feelings, man. Listen. Believe your eyes. The museum's founding director, Lonnie Bunch, says the discovery of the Clotilda tells a unique story about how pervasive the slave trade was even into the dawn of the Civil War. One of the things that's so powerful about this is by showing that the slave trade went later than most people think. It talks about how central slavery was to America's economic growth and also to America's identity, Bunch says. Curators and researchers have been in conversation with the descendants of the Clotilda survivors to make sure that the scientific authentication of the ship also involved community engagement. No, no, hold on. This is how you want it, right? In a nice little neat bow. Let's shake it. The significance of the find was also on the minds of SWP members involved in the search for the schooner, like diver Kamal Siddiqui, an archaeology advocate and instructor with Diving with a Purpose. Diving with a Purpose. There are no photographs of the site where the Clotilda was found or of the wreck itself. The ship wasn't very deep, 8 to 10 feet at most, Siddiqui recalls, but the conditions are sort of treacherous. Visibility was almost zero, and there's some current. But the most important thing is that you're among wreckage that you cannot see. Wow. Siddiqui was also part of the dive team that worked the South African site of the slave ship, São José Parquet de Africa, one of the first historically documented ships carrying enslaved Africans when it sank. Artifacts from the ship, including iron ballast, a wooden pulley, and slave shackles, are on display at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Siddiqui says touching that vessel made him hear the screams and horrors and the suffering of those aboard. But working with the Africatown community and the Clotilda search was intimate for him on a different level. I knew what that ship represents, the story and the pain of the descendant community. I've heard the voices. I can look at them. I've heard the voices. I can look them in the eye and see the pain of the whole Africatown experience over the past 100+ years, Siddiqui explained. Bunch says this feels powerful and emotional to him in a similar way to when he was able to lay his hands upon the iron ballast from the São José, which brought him to tears. Brunt says this feels powerful. And we know feelings are facts. What's different about this is that when we did the São José, a part of it is because there were human remains there. And that was really a way to honor those folks. With the Clotilda, we honor not the remains, but the survival of the people who created Africatown, he says. What's different about this is that when we did the São José, a part of it is because there were human remains there. And that was really a way to honor those folks. With the Clotilda, we honor not the remains, but the survival of the people who created Africatown, he says. The Clotilda. Look. Look. The surviving wreckage. It wasn't deep at all. It was right there. She explained that one possibility is a big read program where community residents collectively read and reflect upon Zora Neale Hurston's book, Barracoon. The book is based on Hurston's 1927 interviews with Cujo Lewis, brother of Charlie Lewis, and one of the last survivors of the Clotilda. In his own dialect, Cujo Lewis tells the story of his capture, his journey to the U.S., and the beginning of Africa Town. In his own dialect, Cujo Lewis tells the story of his capture. I'm sure Zora Neale Hurston would have wrote what his dialect was. She was thorough, right? Y'all know she was thorough. Or was she? In his own dialect. What dialect? Cujo Lewis. Cujo Lewis spoke in what dialect? Zora Neale Hurston was thorough. Come on now. I'm talking about a scholar here. We call our village African Town. Oh, this is his dialect. We call our village African. I'm going to try to read his dialect. I can actually read his dialect. So his dialect is the same dialect we use. So I'm going to read it. We call our village African Town. African Town. He said African Town. We say that because we want to go back into Africa soil. And we see we can't go. Therefore, we make the Africa where they fetch us. God, here, stupid. Let's shake it. Nigeria and world news. They playing with us. Who playing with us? Y'all tell me who playing with us. Pause. By Rukuv Ochuko. What is Africa's original name? The name Africa is a phenomenon. A school of thought argued that the name Africa never originated from within the people, and her people were never associated with the name. In Kemetic History of Africa, Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop writes, the ancient name of Africa was Alkebulan, or Alkebulan, mother of mankind, or Garden of Eden. Alkebulan is the oldest and the only word of indigenous origin. It was used by the Moors, Nubians, Numidians, Carthaginians, Carthaginians, and Ethiopians. Africa, the current misnomer adapted by almost everyone today, was given to the continent by the ancient Greeks and Romans. He goes on to argue along with historians in the school that the continent was also called by many names aside Alkebulan. These names include Ortygia, Corphi, Libya, and Ethiopia. According to history scholars, the name Africa came into existence in the late 17th century. The name was only initially used only to refer to the northern parts of Africa. The word Africa was initiated by the Europeans and came into Western use through the Romans after the 3 Punic battles, led by Publius Cornelius Scipio and the people of Carthage, which is present-day Tunisia. Various theories suggest that the word Africa is derived from both a Greek and Latin origin. The Greek word freak, the Greek word freak, no, I'm not bullshit. The Greek word freak, meaning cold and horror, and the Latin word aprica, meaning sunny. According to Motosoko Fiko on African history, an African history scholar, he writes that Africa is also one of the oldest names of the continent. He further argues that the thought that claims that name Africa never originated from the people and was created by Romans is totally false. Africatown native Anderson Flynn hopes it brings his birthplace the attention it needs in terms of equity for a community he feels has been deliberately decimated. He says he doesn't know if he is related directly to the Clotilda survivors. Africatown native Anderson Flynn hopes it brings his birthplace the attention it needs in terms of equity for a community he feels has been deliberately decimated. He says he doesn't know if he is related directly to the Clotilda survivors. There's been a lack of thoroughness as it relates to African American history because of what happened to them. And so our history is really one that is a mystery to many of us. And therefore, there's a void and pain, Flynn says. And now we're able to tell their part of the story. And that's the joy I get from knowing the Clotilda was not just a myth, it was a living thing that happened. And the deception continues. The mystery continues. He just said, there's been a lack of thoroughness as it relates to African American history because of what happened to them. And so our history is really one that is a mystery to so many of us. And therefore, there's a void and pain. And Flynn says, and Flynn, homie, you're contributing to that void and that pain. And you're continuing to perpetuate a mystery for mystery's sake. You know what? I don't think Flynn wants to know the truth. Find out who your two parents are, who your 4 grandparents are, who your 8 great grandparents are, who your 16 second grades, 32 third grades, 64 fourth grades, so on and so forth. And then, it'll be less of a mystery to you. Let's shake it. Time. Here's how high planes actually fly, according to experts. Celine Hokobian, 2018. It turns out there's a specific altitude range airplanes must stay in while flying because of a few factors like the type of aircraft, the distance to your destination, the type of engine they have, the strength of the winds, and the weight of the airplane. One reason that planes cruise above the clouds is so they can fly fast. The higher airplanes climb, the thinner the air gets, and the more efficiently they can fly because of less resistance in the atmosphere, according to Ryan Jorgensen, an aviation data analyst. Commercial aircraft typically fly between 31,000 and 38,000 feet above 38,000 feet, about 5.9 to 7.2 miles. high and usually reach their cruising altitudes in the first 10 minutes of a flight, according to Beckman. Planes can fly much higher than this altitude, but that can present safety issues. Flying higher means it would take a longer time to return to a safe altitude in case of an emergency, like rapid decompression, Beckman says. It also isn't the most efficient use of fuel to fly that high in the first place, he says, since planes can fly at a lower altitude with the assistance of wind. Another reason why planes don't fly higher is due to the weight of the aircraft. The more you weigh, the harder it is to get to a certain altitude, says Jorgensen. This is from Flying Magazine. How fast do commercial planes fly? Flying Staff, 2022. No matter which type you use, all airspeed is represented in knots. Maximum speed for popular airplanes. Today's commercial airplanes won't take you across the Atlantic Ocean in less than a few hours. Most major airliners travel at decent speeds. Boeing 747, 614 miles per hour. Boeing 737, 588 miles per hour. Airbus A380, 737 miles per hour. Private jets can fly at speeds anywhere between 400 and 700 miles per hour, but a handful of ultra-long-range jets can fly more than 8,000 miles or 6,952 nautical miles. Military aircraft. Here are a few examples from different categories. Lockheed Martin C-130J, 416 miles per hour. Lockheed Martin F-22 Fighter, 1,500 miles per hour. Boeing KC-135 Air Refueler, 580 miles per hour. Northrop Grumman B-2 Bombers, 628 miles per hour. Northrop Grumman RQ-4 Surveillance, 391 miles per hour. Single-engine airplanes such as a Cessna 172 fly around 140 miles per hour, 122 knots. Some of the more advanced single-engine airplanes like the Pilatus, PC-12, NGX have a top speed of 334 miles per hour, or 290 knots. This is from Aero Corner. Top 10 best stealth fighter jets. Stealth jets have the ability to shoot off into the wild blue yonder and then appear out of the blue undetected by radar systems. Wow. Stealth technology is still new, and many states are in the process of developing stealth fighters as either advanced 5th or 6th generation jets. Lockheed Martin F-22 Raptor. Made by Lockheed Martin for the United States Air Force, the F-22 entered service back in 2005. The Air Force claimed at the time that it was unmatched by any known aircraft. The F-22 is 62 feet, 1 inch long, can reach Mach 2.25 via 2x Pratt and Whitney F-119 PW100 augmented turbofans, and are armed with the 20mm M61A2 Vulcan rotary cannon and air-to-air and air-to-ground missiles, including, y'all finish that. You get the picture. Lockheed Martin F-35 Lightning II. The next in F-Series from Lockheed Martin, this advanced stealth fighter jet is one of the most state-of-the-art fighter jets in the world and is produced for the United States Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps, as well as the Royal Air Force. It uses radar absorbent materials to minimize its radar cross section. Number 3, the Chengdu J-20. Made by the Chengdu Aircraft Corporation for the Chinese Armed Forces, the J-20 was the third stealth jet fighter and the first one not created for the U.S. Air Force. Sukhoi Su-57. Made by Sukhoi for the Russian Armed Forces, the Su-57 is the latest in the long line of Su fighter jets, which were the backbone of the USSR Air Force. Shenyang FC-31, also known as the J-31. This model remains in the prototype phase. Mitsubishi FX. This ongoing stealth fighter project in Japan is still in the early stages. A prototype is planned for 2024, the first flight test for 2028, and if all goes well, mass production could begin as early as 2031. Mikoyan MiG-41. Currently under production by Mikoyan, this is another example of a stealth fighter which is still in the planning stages. HESA Shafak. With its first flight taking place in 2017, this model is still under development for the Iranian Air Force. Kai KF-X, a joint South Korean-Indonesian venture. This stealth fighter jet program is still in development. HAL-AMCA, HAL-AMCA. The stealth jet fighter being developed for the Indian Air Force. Okay, we move on to simple flying. Which aircraft have the longest range? Modern aircraft that fly thousands of miles without a refueling stop. We don't want to include a one-off prototype that can fly around the world on a single tank if you can't buy a ticket to fly on it. An empty aircraft stripped of everything, including seats and entertainment, can fly a lot further than a full cargo carrier, and thus would not be fair. The fastest fighter jet ever created was the NASA USAF X-15. It was an experimental aircraft that resembled more of a rocket with wings, but managed to reach a record 4,520 miles per hour. The fastest fighter jet in the world today is the MiG-25 Foxbat, with the top speed of 2,190 miles per hour, half the speed of the X-15. The NASA USAF X-15 is the fastest fighter jet ever produced. It reached record top speed of Mach 6.72 or 4,520 miles per hour, which is more than 5 times the speed of sound. The X-125 was an experimental hypersonic rocket-powered aircraft developed in the 1960s and still holds the record for the highest speed ever recorded by a crewed-powered aircraft. The fastest fighter jet is the Mikoyan Gurevich MiG-25 Foxbat, capable of Mach 3.2 or 2,190 miles per hour. A Russian-built interceptor introduced in 1970, over 50 years on, and the MiG-25 has remained one of the fastest fighter jets ever, and although no longer in production and in limited service, is still used by a few air forces around the world. Still used by a few air forces across the world. Top 10 fastest fighter jets in the world. NASA USA F-X-15, 4,520 miles per hour, American, experimental. Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird, 2,500 miles per hour, American, reconnaissance. Lockheed YF-12, 2,275 miles per hour, American, prototype. MiG-25 Foxbat, 2,190 miles per hour, Russian, interceptor. Bell X-2 Starbuster, 2,094 miles per hour, American, research. XB-70 Valkyrie, 2,056 miles per hour, American, bomber. Bomber. MiG-31 Foxhound, 1,864 miles per hour, Russian, interceptor. F-15 Eagle, 1,650 miles per hour, American, multi-role. Do a bunch of shit. F-111 Aardvark, 1,650 miles per hour, American, bomber. Su-27 Flanker, 1,553 miles per hour, Russian, multi-role. Which aircraft has the longest range? The original long-haul aircraft was the Boeing 747 SP with a range of 6,650 nautical miles. This would later be beaten by the Boeing 777-200LR, long range at 8,555 nautical miles, and the Airbus A340 at a colossal 9,000 nautical miles. The true crown today belongs to the Airbus A350, has an impressive range of 8,700 nautical miles. Singapore Airlines Airbus built the Airbus 350 A350 900 ULR, ultra long range, that can dominate distances as far as 8,700. Can dominate distances as far as 9,700 nautical miles. Today, the A350 900 ULR is the longest range aircraft in the world. This is from Simple Flying, the top 10 largest planes ever made, by Justin Hayward. Airbus 380, Boeing 747-8, Boeing 777-9, Antonov An-124, Lockheed C-5 Galaxy, Airbus Beluga XL, Boeing Dreamlifter, the longest planes ever made, Hughes H-4 Hercules, Stratolaunch. Okay. National Air and Space Museum, 1903 Wright Flyer. First successful powered airplane with a pilot aboard. Wilbur and Orville Wright spent 4 years of research and development to create the first successful powered airplane, the 1903 Wright Flyer. Canard biplane with 112 horsepower Wright horizontal four-cylinder engine driven two-pusher propellers via sprocket and chain transmission system. Non-wheeled linear skids act as landing gear. Natural fabric finish, no sealant or paint of any kind. Wingspan 40 feet 4 inches, length 21 feet 1 inch, height 9 feet 4 inches, weight 605 pounds. Frame made of wood, fabric covering, muslin. Okay, history hit. Before the Wright brothers, history's early flying machines. War kites of medieval China and Japan. Already during the early medieval age, states were trying to use the skies for military purposes. Man-carrying kites, for example, were used in the ancient times, with some of the earliest sources dating back to the 6th century CE. The main purpose of these kites was to gather information about the terrain or to locate enemy positions. Aylmer of Malmesbury's wings. Aylmer attached wings to his hands and feet and launched himself from the top of a tower at Malmesbury Abbey. It is said that he was airborne for 15 seconds, covering about 200 meters before landing and breaking both of his legs. Da Vinci's wings. The Renaissance genius Leonardo da Vinci had many ideas on how humans could take flight. There are legends that he tried out his invention with one of his apprentices, though the lack of concrete evidence casts doubt on these claims. The Ottoman rocket. Lagari Hassan Celebi was an Ottoman aviator who, based on Traveller Elvelia Celebi's account, made a successful manned rocket flight. The claim is that in 1633, Lagari launched a 7-winged rocket fueled by gunpowder in Istanbul. It is said that before takeoff, Lagari jokingly exclaimed something along the lines of, "My Sultan, I'm going to talk to the Prophet Jesus." He landed safely in the sea, swimming back ashore. De Terzi's flying boat. The idea for this quirky-looking flying machine came from Italian priest Francisco Laria de Terzi. His design had a central mast to which a sail was attached, and 4 masts which had thin copper foil spears attached to them. The air would be pumped out of the spears, leaving a vacuum inside. Bartholomew de Gusmau's lighter than air airship. The first modern manned hot air balloon. Cayley's glider. In 1804, he successfully flew in a glider that he designed. The aerial steam carriage. The Albatross aircraft. The glider was built by French sea captain and sailor Jean-Marie Lebris. In 1856, he flew briefly on the beach with his aircraft being placed on a cart towed by a horse. Reportedly, he reached a height of 100 meters and covered a distance of 200 meters. With the support of the French Navy, he built a second model in 1868, which has the distinction of being the first ever aircraft to be photographed. Victor Tatton's airplane. Clement Adair's Avion 3. Town Talk. Aviation history. Did you know 2 Louisiana men built first airship working helicopter? Melinda Martinez. Alexandria Town Talk. 2022. 2 figures from central Louisiana were among the first to help mankind get their feet off the ground in the early 1900s. Those men were Charles Page of Pineville, who built the first airship, and Leo Ortega of Alexandria, who built the first working manned helicopter. Charles Page was the first black man to hold a patent for a plane. Charles Page is an absolutely fascinating American, said Mike Wine, local historian. He was actually born a slave. He was actually born a worker. He was actually born an employee. He was actually born a laborer in 1864. How are you born a worker in 1864? We believe, well, a bit of history. My grandfather was also born a worker. He was also born an employee. Guess who his employer was? His father. He worked on his farm. Yet, in 1898, he decided to create an airplane. When said Page's grandson, Joseph P. Page, was told that Page would watch bugs fly and say, I could do that. What he did in 1903 was build a flying model of the first airship, said Joseph P. Page. In 1904, he decided to use his life savings to build a full-scale model of the airplane and ship it to Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis, Missouri, said Wynn. The exposition was also known as the St. Louis World's Fair. Page received his patent in April of 1906. He received his patent before the Wright brothers received their patent for the airship, but he let it expire. He was a timberman. He farmed. Okay. Heart of Louisiana, Charles Page's airship. By Tiffany Baptiste, Pineville, Louisiana. This may be one of the more remarkable moments in aviation history that you've never heard of. About the time the Wright brothers were flying their first airplane, a Pineville, Louisiana man was doing the same thing. The idea started with a dragonfly. He would watch those things in flight for hours at a time. Charles Page, a farmer and timberman in Pineville, Louisiana. At an early age, I was told that he had this invention, the airship or the airplane, says Katie. The year was 1903 when Charles Page turned his inspiration from a flying insect into an airship. Page got a patent for his airship in 1906 before the Wright brothers. He planned to enter his airship in a competition for a $100,000 prize at the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis. He took his life savings. He built a working model, tested it at home in Pineville, and then shipped it off by train to St. Louis, Missouri, where he was going to fly the airplane in St. Louis, Missouri, and then become a chapter in all of our history books, says Michael Wynn. But the aircraft never arrived at the World's Fair. His plane was destroyed or stolen. Charles Chappell, 1872-1941. Daniel Helton, 2018. Charles Ward Chappell was an American engineer and businessman, best known for his award-winning long-distance airplane in 1911 and his tenure as president of the African Union Company from 1913 to 1930. In January of 1911, Chappell presented at the first Industrial Aero Show, a showcase of aircraft and aeronautical technologies in Brooklyn, New York. Brooklyn. It's always somebody from Brooklyn in the house. Chappell, an architect and engineer by trade, had invented an airplane that was designed to safely travel long distances. Chappell was born in Eatonton, Georgia in 1872. He grew up in Atlanta before moving to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1897. Time, the Wright brothers, pioneers of patent trolling, by Sean Trainer. On this day in 1903, brothers Orville and Wilbur Wright made what many consider the world's first successful heavier-than-air flight. It propelled them over the decade to come into courtrooms throughout Europe and North America. In the courts, the Wright brothers waged a prolonged, embarrassing, and largely unsuccessful battle against other early aviators over who owned the aeronautical principles that made flight possible. The birds own aeronautical principle that made flights possible, right? The Wrights' competitors complained the theory behind the machines as the common property of humanity and argued that the Wrights' patent pertained only to the mechanics of their airplane itself. The Wrights proved themselves pioneers of what's sometimes known as patent trolling, the controversial modern practice of suing competitors for infringements that fall beyond the scope of one's patent. WRAL News. Only black ultralight aircraft builder in the U.S. lives in Edgecombe County. The only black manufacturer of ultralight aircraft in the country lives on a farm in rural Edgecombe County, 2022. by Keenan Willard. In a garage on his farm in the town of Whitakers, Sylvester Hill is building a plane. Sylvester Hill is the only black builder in the country of ultralight aircraft. There is one-seater planes equipped with motors and a glider or a parachute to take flight. Hill has designed, manufactured, and flown his own planes from his farm in Whitakers for the last 15 years. Part of a passion for flying that goes back to the 1970s when ultralights were first invented. Hill quickly became one of the first certified ultralight pilots in the country. Library of Congress. Who invented the automobile? The history of the automobile is very rich and dates back to the 15th century when Leonardo da Vinci was creating designs and models for transport vehicles. There are different types of automobiles: steam, electric, and gasoline. Exactly who invented the automobile is a matter of opinion. Earlier accounts often gave credit to Carl Benz from Germany for creating the first true automobile in 1885, 1886. So we have here inventors, dates, the type of automobile, and the country. Nicholas Joseph Cugnot, 1769. Steam, uh, from France. Robert Anderson, 1832, 1839. Electric carriage, Scotland. Talking about electric vehicles. Carl Benz, 1885, 1886. Gasoline, Germany. Gottlieb Wilhelm Daimler. William Maybach. Wilhelm Maybach, 1886. Gasoline, Germany. George Baldwin Selden, 1876. Gasoline, United States. Charles Edgar Dury and his brother Frank, 1893. Gasoline, United States. Electric vehicles ain't a new thing. Mercedes-Benz Group, 1885, 1886. The first automobile. The first stationary gasoline engine developed by Carl Benz was a one-cylinder, two-stroke unit, which ran for the first time on New Year's Eve, 1879. New Year's Eve, Carl Benz broke it out. New Year's Eve, 1879, he jumped down. Let's shake it. The major features of the two-seater vehicle, which was completed in 1885, were the compact high-speed single-cylinder four-stroke engine installed horizontally at the rear, the tubular steel frame, the differential, and three-wire spoked wheels. That's right. On January 29, 1886, Carl Benz applied for a patent for his vehicle powered by a gas engine. The patent number 37435 may be regarded as the birth certificate of the automobile. Okay. George Selden granted granted first U.S. patent for an automobile, November 5th, 1895. Amy Norcross. George B. Selden, a patent lawyer and inventor from Rochester, New York, was granted a U.S. patent in late 1895 for an improved road engine powered by a liquid hydrocarbon engine of the compression type. Inspired by George Brayton's internal combustion engine that was displayed at the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876, Selden began working on a smaller, lighter version. He succeeded 2 years later in producing a one-cylinder, 400-pound version, which featured an enclosed crankshaft. The announcement took place 8 years before the public introduction of the Benz patent motor wagon in Europe. The Benz patent motor wagon, built in 1886, is widely regarded as the first automobile. Selden's patent application, originally filed May 8, 1879, included not only the engine but also its use in a four-wheeled car. Several amendments to the application stretched out the process and delayed the granting of the patent until November 5th, 1895. George B. Selden, on the right, drives an early automobile in 1905. They look vulnerable in that automobile. And he couldn't ride that automobile today. In 1899, Selden sold his patent to the EVC, Electric Vehicle Company, which comprised a group of investors. They, in turn, sued the Winton Motor Carriage Company, the largest car manufacturer in the United States, for infringing on the Selden patent just by building gas-powered cars. Winton settled, and the court upheld Selden's patent in 1903. To protect the patent, several major car manufacturers, including Winton, Packard, and Cadillacs, got together with Selden and the EVC to form ALAM, the Association of Licensed Automobile Manufacturers. Henry Ford, owner of the Ford Motor Company, founded in Detroit, Michigan in 1903, initially applied for ALAM membership, but his application was rejected. Later that year, the ALAM sued Ford and others for patent infringement. The heavily publicized legal fight lasted 8 years and ended in a victory for Selden. Ford appealed, and on January 10, 1911, 1 year before Selden's patent was set to expire, won his case based on an argument that the engine used in automobiles was not based on George Brayton's engine, the engine that Selden had improved, but on the Otto engine. Mythcreants. Land travel before engines. Before cars and trains, traveling over land was exhausting and dangerous. Without engines, land travel was slow and punishing. People only had access to good roads if they lived in a powerful nation. Building and maintaining roads was expensive. Creating roads was an enormous construction project requiring engineering, cartography, and plentiful labor. Wheels require a smooth, level path. If your society doesn't have roads in good order, your characters can't use wheels when they travel. In ancient Japan, the government protected some regions by leaving rivers without bridges. Preventing illegal tolls and keeping bandits away required not just patrols, but diplomacy or conquest. Roads became useless when travelers were taxed by every one of a dozen fiefdoms along their journey, much less robbed, captured, or killed. The famous Silk Road, an overland trading route that branched all the way from eastern China to the Mediterranean Sea, often depended on the Chinese Empire to stay open. Travelers going in the same direction would usually stick together. Large groups sent out advance and rear guards to watch for thieves. Meetings between travelers and locals were filled with uncertainty. Language barriers were common, and each locality might have its own laws that travelers didn't know about. In ancient Japan, fruit trees were even planted along some roads to offer travelers shade and refreshment. Some governments would allow the nobility to use their way stations or mandate that people living near the road had to host nobles that came through. Routes that were popular with traders would have businesses such as inns to accommodate them. If you want to know about yesterday, look at today. Lower class travelers stayed at temples, monasteries, hospitals, or hospices. Before engines, all overland travel relied on animal power. Often those animals were humans. However, people traveling on foot are not slow. When we're fit, humans are the epitome of endurance. Theoretically, a relay of horses and riders would provide the quickest land travel, but the fastest we have on record was actually a relay of human runners. In the ancient Inca Empire, a network of human runners carried messages 150 miles a day over mountains, too. Some of the impoverished Mormons moving west in colonial America pulled hand carts. They sound small, but they're not. Imagine a wheelbarrow with wheels 5 feet in diameter. The hand cart usually carried 250 pounds, but could go up to 500 pounds. About 5 people would share one hand cart, though it was only pulled by one person at a time. Many travelers went without shoes during mild weather. When animals were available, affordable, and capable of managing the terrain, they were invariably used. Like people, animals that weren't used to travel had to build up their strength and endurance. After traveling a while, hooves or pads might wear down, making an animal lame. Animals also have to eat and drink. Camel caravans would have to bring feed on trips over bare desert, and horses need higher quality feed than what is found in most places. When travelers had sufficient money, as with traders, or were in large groups that pooled their resources, as with wagon trains, they usually hired a guide to help them navigate. If travelers had to navigate without the help of a local, they might use a map. Maps were difficult to make. Before land travel was easy and common, people rarely knew much about the land outside where they lived. Cartography not only required vast knowledge of the terrain, but also accurate ways to measure direction and distance. Without maps, travelers used directions they'd been given. A navigator would reference local landmarks, and determine directions by the sun or the North Star at night. The wind direction was also helpful when traveling through sand or fresh snow. Wind will change the orientation of ripples or drift. And because you're technologically savvy, you think you're better off. When we're talking about without maps, travelers use directions they'd been given. A navigator would reference local landmarks and determine direction by the sun or the North Star at night. The wind direction was also helpful when traveling through sand or fresh snow. Wind would change the orientation of ripples or drifts. Can you do that? Is the wind helpful to you? Do you look at landmarks? Do you use directions that you were given without your GPS? Unbelievable. Unbelievable. You and a lot of people who look like you would say that you better off today than you was yesterday, and you not. Travelers would require tools for long journeys. Not you. You'll stop at a gas station. You'll stop at a rest stop. You'll stop at a restaurant. What tools do you have for a long journey? Some broccoli. Many travelers died of thirst or starvation. Travelers faced many dangers: terrain, other people, animals, sickness, weather. Colonial travel. ConstitutionFacts.com. Colonial travel. Whether by land or by sea, 18th century colonial travel was arduous, expensive, and many times dangerous because of the many few people traveled very far from their homes. Because of this, many few people traveled very far from their homes. In those days, it was fairly expensive to travel. Because of this, generally, only government officials, merchants, and planters took the risk. There were various modes of transportation. There were various modes of transportation available to the colonists. The most common mode and the cheapest was walking. People would travel by foot for extraordinary distances to get supplies or visit friends and family. The lower classes rarely, if ever, traveled for pleasure. Another popular means of travel, especially in the southern colonies, was by horseback. Okay. The official blog of newspapers.com. Horse and buggy, the primary means of transportation in the 19th century. Jenny Ashcraft. Today's high performance cars have had upwards of 700 horsepower, but in the 1800s, typical horse and buggy transportation consisted of 1 or 2 horsepower. Horses and other animals, including oxen and donkeys, provided the primary means of transportation all over the world through the 19th century. Transporting people and goods was a costly venture in the 19th century. Animals required large quantities of food and water. Wagon wheels formed deep ruts that in some places are still visible today, and those same dirt paths turn into a muddy mess when wet. Federal Highway Administration: Transportation in America's Postal System by Ricky Longfellow. In early colonial times, letter writers sent their correspondences by friends, merchants, and Native Americans via foot or horseback. Around 1691, Thomas Neal of England received a 21-year grant from the British Crown for a postal service in the colonies. Neal never came to America. This did not prove to be a lucrative move for him. He died in debt after assigning his postal interests over to fellow Englishmen Andrew Hamilton and R. West. In 1707, the British government bought the rights to the North American Postal Service from West and the widow of Hamilton. John Hamilton, the widow's son, was appointed Deputy Postmaster General of America. By 1800, the Post Office Department had purchased a number of stagecoaches for mail transport. Steamboats were used for mail carrying where no road existed. In the 1830s, trains transported some mail, 4.5 miles in 35 minutes, in the East. But Americans were migrating and tracks would take decades to span to newly settled areas. By the 1850s, the population began to flow into the newly acquired Louisiana, Oregon, and California territories. Wagon trains transported some of the mail, but were often targets of ambushes and other tragedies. In 1860, the Pony Express was the brainchild of William H. Russell. Except for a few settlements and military forts, the route beyond St. Joseph was a vast unknown land inhabited by natives. Russell, with 2 partners, built relay stations every 5 to 20 miles with fresh horses. There was an estimated 150 to 190 relay stations. On an average day, a rider could cover 100 miles. Riders were paid from $50 to $100 per month, ranging in age from 11 to the mid-40s. Weighing less than 125 pounds, the horses were changed every 10 to 15 miles at the relay stations, with riders averaging about 10 miles per hour. The fastest piece of mail in the history of the Pony Express was President Abraham Lincoln's inaugural address. It was carried to California in 7 days and 17 hours. The National Museum of the American Indian, Washington, D.C. Travel. Horses transformed travel. Before the arrival of horses, native people traveled on foot or by canoe. When the hunting tribes of the Great Plains moved camp, teepees and household goods were usually carried by women or by dogs pulling travois. The distance anyone could travel in a day was limited. But with horses, tribes could move farther and faster because horses could haul larger loads. Traverse increased in size, and so did teepees. Documenting in American South, the Westover manuscripts containing the history of the dividing line betwixt Virginia and North Carolina, a journey to the land of Eden, AD 1733, and a progress to the mines, written from 1728 to 1736, and now first published. William Byrd, 1674 through 1744, Edmund Ruffin, 1794, 1865. The Westover manuscripts by William Byrd. The manuscripts of Colonel William Byrd of Westover, the father of the last proprietor of the same name, of different dates from 1728 to 1736, are contained in a large folio volume bound in parchment, which has been carefully preserved in his family until recently placed in the hands of the editor. Colonel William Byrd died where he had long lived, at his then beautifully decorated and princely mansion, Westover, on the north bank of James River, and which even at this late day exhibits admirable remains of his taste and his magnificent scale of expenditure for its gratification. The Westover manuscripts. William Byrd. But about the year 1620, a large swarm of dissenters fled thither from the severities of their stepmother, the church. These saints conceiving the same aversion to the copper complexion of the natives, with that of the first adventure to Virginia, would on no terms contract alliances with them, afraid perhaps, like the Jews of old, lest they might be drawn into idolatry by those strange women, those strange copper-colored women. The Indians, who have no way of traveling but on the hoof, make nothing of going 25 miles a day and carrying their little necessaries at their backs, and sometimes a stout pack of skins into the bargain. And very often they laugh at the English, who cannot stir to a next neighbor without a horse, and say that 2 legs are too much for such lazy people, who cannot visit their next neighbor without 6. For their parts, they were utter strangers to all our beasts of burthen or carriage before the slothful Europeans came amongst them. Field Guide for all the birds of North America. North American ducks. There are at least 29 types of native ducks seen in North America. Not included among these waterfowl are the eiders, loons, mergansers, and grebes, which make up another 14 species of waterfowl. Then there are the swans and geese, which is another 8 species of large members of the waterfowl group. Dabblers mostly feed in smaller bodies of shallow water or along shorelines, where they are able to tip their bodies forward to reach their food on the floors of the bodies of water. Then there are divers who feed in deeper water where they dive and pursue their quarry. The harlequin duck, for example, actually dives to the bottom of the fast-flowing waters and feeds on life forms attached to rocks. Bird watching HQ, 25 types of ducks in the United States. Diving ducks completely submerge themselves underwater to grab aquatic vegetation from the bottom or chase food such as fish or invertebrates. They have adapted narrower, pointier, and overall smaller wings, which are perfect for swimming underwater. The mallard ducks are definitely the most common species in the United States. Mallards are extremely comfortable around people, which is why these adaptable ducks are so widespread. They are found in virtually any wetland habitat, no matter where it's located. American widgeons are numerous, but they prefer quiet lakes and marshes away from people. Gadwalls are easy ducks to overlook in the United States. Look for them in small ponds that have lots of vegetation. Gadwalls have a funny habit of stealing food from diving ducks upon surfacing, with American coots being their favorite victim. In the summer, animal matter can make up 50% of their diet, whereas it drops to around 5% in winter. Submerged aquatic vegetation is their primary food source. Northern pintails have a long neck that exaggerates their extremely pointy tail, hence the name, when in flight. Even when floating on water, its tail sticks out further from its body than its head. The best place to find these ducks in the United States is wetland habitat away from people. They tend to stick to shallower areas near the edges of lakes and ponds. They are also proficient at walking on land, so you'll find them cleaning farm fields of barley, wheat, rice, and corn leftovers. Northern pintails are incredible flyers. They reach speeds up to 48 miles per hour, and the record for longest non-stop flight is 1,800 miles. Northern shovelers are known for and how they got their name. They use their large bill to shovel and sift through mud and sand to find tasty tidbits like crustaceans, mollusks, aquatic insects that are buried. Their bill has over 100 tiny projections on the edges called lamellae that help filter out the food they want to eat. Flocks of them will sometimes swim in circles together to help stir up food. Blue-winged teals are found in shallow wetlands across the United States. These beautiful waterfowl are the second most abundant duck in North America, behind only the mallard. Green-winged teals are the smallest dabbling ducks you will find in the United States. This is one of the few duck species in the United States you may see in a tree. Wood ducks use abandoned tree cavities for nesting. Wood ducks are perfectly evolved for their life spent in trees. Their claws are powerful, which allows them to perch and grasp onto branches. American black ducks have a name that doesn't describe them very well. They don't have any black on them. Sound familiar? Black, bliggity, black, black, black. Found in the United States in shallow wetlands where they often forage. Cinnamon teals nest and are most abundant in large permanent wetlands in the United States. They are most often seen at the edges of reeds and other vegetation. Using their long legs, black-bellied whistling ducks spend a lot of time out of water, walking or perching on fences or in trees. In fact, they even nest in trees in old woodpecker holes. These ducks are primarily vegetarians. In addition to aquatic vegetation like geese, they also eat similar leftover crops such as corn, rice, and wheat. Fulvous whistling ducks. In the United States, they are most likely found near rice fields, crayfish farms, or flooded pastures. These places provide both food and an ideal water depth for them, which is less than 20 inches. Bufflehead. They spend up to half their time foraging underwater, looking for aquatic invertebrates and crustaceans, which they eat while still submerged. Canvasbacks are large diving ducks that rarely ever go to dry land. In fact, they even sleep while floating and build their nest in masses of floating vegetation. They can dive up to 7 feet deep. Ruddy duck. Ruddy ducks are much better swimmers than flyers. When they feel threatened by a predator, they much prefer to dive and swim away than taking to the air. Redheads. In winter, it's common to see them gathered together in enormous flocks, sometimes thousands strong in relatively large lakes. Ring-necked duck tend to inhabit and visit shallow ponds and wetlands in the United States. Common golden eyes are expert diving ducks in the United States. These birds can stay underwater for up to a minute in length as they search for their prey. Hooded mergansers. Shallow ponds and rivers in summer, while in winter, they move to unfrozen lakes or bays. They hunt underwater by sight and have vision adaptations that allow them to see quite clearly when submerged. Red-breasted mergansers breed in boreal forest across much of North America, where they can be found on many inland lakes. During winter, these sea ducks migrate south and spend most of their time just off the coast, although it's possible to find them in just about any large, unfrozen body of water. Although it's possible to find them in just about any large, unfrozen body of water. Fish are their primary food source, and they need to eat roughly 15 to 20 per day to supply their energy demands. They need to make about 250 dives per day. Lesser scalps are the most abundant diving duck in North America. They are mostly found in large lakes, reservoirs, and estuaries, where they can gather by the thousands. Greater scalp spends its summers breeding extremely far north in the Arctic. These birds are almost always seen in large bodies of water. Greater scalps are excellent diving ducks, and they regularly go down 20 plus feet to find aquatic vegetation or invertebrates to eat. Harlequin duck. They breed and raise their young mainly alongside fast-moving rivers. In winter, they move to rocky ocean shores that receive lots of wind and large waves. Wildlife boss. How fast can ducks swim? Speeds and statistics. All ducks spend a large portion of their time in the water. Diving ducks or just divers do? Diving ducks or just divers do what their name suggests. They dive. Unlike dabbling ducks who like shallow water, divers prefer deeper, more open water. They can dive down to 40 feet to look for various invertebrates, fish, and snails to eat. Most often, though, divers stay in water because 1.5 and 6. Most often, though, divers stay in water between 1.5 and 6 feet deep. They'll stay underwater from 10 to 20 seconds, though they can also stay underwater longer if they need to. Ducks are a type of waterfowl, meaning they spend a lot of time in the water. Despite this, not much is known about their specific swimming speeds as opposed to their flying speeds. In the studies conducted, a few species of ducks could swim between 0.6 and 3 miles per hour. This is slow both compared to other swimming birds and the flight speed of the ducks themselves. However, due to their flight abilities and migratory natures, ducks don't need to swim very fast, either for travel or for safety. PETA. Animals are not ours. Ducks are well adapted for water, land, and air activities. These gifted swimmers have waterproof feathers which have a waxy coating that protect an inner layer of down to keep them warm and dry. They can swim in cold water without catching a chill because their feet have blood vessels that are close together so they don't lose heat. Some duck species can dive up to 240 feet below the water, and others can fly as high as 21,000 feet in the air, although most migrate at heights of 200 to 4,000 feet. They can also fly long distances, and they use wind to help them reach speeds of up to 60 miles per hour. The shape of ducks' eyes allows them to see things near and far simultaneously, and in sharp focus. And since their eyes are located on either side of their head, they are able to see almost 340 degrees around. They can also move each eye independently and sleep with one eye open to watch for predators. Understanding Waterfowl, Masters of the Air and Water by John M. Colucci, PhD. Whether it's a squadron of wood ducks maneuvering through a mature bottomland hardwood forest, a flock of Canada geese whiffling into a cut cornfield, or a raft of canvasbacks diving for submerged aquatic plants on a wide-swept estuary, the amazing physical abilities of waterfowl have inspired humankind for centuries. Wings and feathers are the most recognizable flight adaptations among waterfowl and other birds. Together, the wing and flight feathers form an airfoil, with rigid primary feathers providing thrust and uniquely shaped secondary feathers creating lift. The vans of these feathers have tiny hooks, known as barbules, that zip the feathers together, giving them additional rigidity and strength. Soft feathers called converts create a smooth surface to improve airflow over the wing. Contour feathers streamline the body. Flight is the most energetically taxing activity that waterfowl undertake, consuming nearly 15 times more energy than resting. The waterfowl skeleton is exceptionally light and strong, consisting of hollow bones that are fused together and reinforced in places to withstand stress and support the bird's large flight muscles. Generously supplied with oxygen-rich blood, these dense red muscles are located near the bird's center of gravity, just below the wings, to provide balance. To power their flight, waterfowl have a large heart. The separation of oxygen-rich and oxygen-depleted blood is extremely efficient and well suited for the rigors of flying. The respiratory tract of waterfowl is also ingeniously designed. This unique system provides continuous, unidirectional airflow, delivering large amounts of oxygen and removing body heat generated while flying. The birds possess proportionately large brains. This combination of acute vision, quick decision making, and high speed nerve transmission allows a wood duck to dip and dive through the limbs of a forested wetland with relative ease. The legs and feet of waterfowl are the most obvious adaptations for aquatic life. Their exceptionally strong legs are set back on the body and their feet are large and webbed. Webbing between the toes expands on the downward stroke, creating greater surface area to push more water. On the upward stroke, the toes fold together to minimize resistance. These motions supply the lift and force needed to propel waterfowl efficiently through the water. Diving ducks also use their webbed feet to dive and swim underwater while foraging. To avoid floating to the surface like a cork, a diving duck must paddle constantly to offset the buoyancy of its body. Webbed feet are also useful for walking in mud. They act like snowshoes to evenly distribute body weight and keep the bird from sinking. Weighing less than a pound on average, the torrent duck has managed to survive for nearly 1 million years by expertly diving for food in the high altitude rivers of the Peruvian Andes. The American ducks never assumed dominion over the earth. Do the right thing.